So I'm going to speak a little bit about getting into UX research and transitioning from a non-tech background to a tech industry. So let me start a little bit about my journey. So I started out as a teacher. I used to teach biology in schools, and since then I've done educational research and pretty much focused on social sciences research. And as the introduction mentioned, I was really interested in scaling ICT innovations in schools. I really wanted to understand these problems that happens in the system, as well as doing a PhD project on actually social justice issues with science education. So that's really the background that I came from, right? So there's like very rigorous academic research. My research projects last 2 to 3 years. Who has that time in UX, right? Like 2 to 3 years, I have to write grants, right? Grants are the only way I get money to do research. So thinking about all of these things, my next question was, do I have what it takes to do UX research? And the long story short, well, I'm happy to report that I currently am doing product research at Asia Super. So, but this did not come from no trials or tribulations throughout my transition process. And I'm just here to share some of my observations from my own experience transitioning from a non-tech background or an academic research background to a UX research. So I want to start here first. So I want to start with taking stock. This is where I began my journey. I asked myself, do I know what UX research is about? What are some of the gaps that I have? What are my strengths? Where have I actually done well in? And where are some of these gaps? Now, this did not happen at one particular point, right? So I take stock at the beginning of my transition process, midway through the process. Every time I hear some feedback, I'm always asking myself, what do I have? What do I not have? Where can I do better, right? So these are some of the things that I always ask myself. And at the bottom line of all of this is actually one foundational question. And the foundational question is, why do I want to do UX research? And that's really, really important, right? Because the transition process is long and onerous and arduous, right? Because coming from a non-UX background to UX research. So if you have the answer to that question, that would actually set the foundation for a lot of things. And for me, the reason why I wanted to do UX research was because I had an intrinsic desire to understand human behavior. I really wanted to know why people did what they did. And when they see a digital product or digital interface, why do they do these things? And when I interacted with digital products or interfaces, I asked myself, why is this placed in this particular way? Actually, I would have liked it if this was done differently. This does not meet my needs, right? So I started from those foundational questions, and that actually kept me going. The next thing is walking the talk. Practice, practice, practice. Now, I came from a non-tech background, from a non-UX background. What does it mean to practice? I don't mean go and do a freelance project. I don't mean go and find some way to do free work or free UX work. And it's not so much about the formal practice. Ask yourself whether can I informally practice UX in my day-to-day life. What that means is going through the design thinking process. For instance, when someone says something to you, ask yourself, is this really the problem that they're facing? What can I know in terms of the limitations of this problem? Where are their assumptions, right? Ask yourself those questions on a day-to-day practice. So for instance, let's say someone says, COVID is just a flu, right? I mean, that sounds like just a random sentence someone says to you in a day-to-day basis. But if you want to practice UX, you would ask yourself, what does it mean by COVID? Let's define COVID. Let's define flu. What are the measures for flu? How do we know the severity of flu versus severity of COVID? How can I measure those things, right? So those are the things you want to drill down to understand the question, to understand the statement further. So practice, 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 and practice that in the day-to-day life. It's not just about the formal working environment that you can practice UX. The next thing is connect with people. I feel like we've actually come and spoken about this at many different instances. We had Mario speaking about it. We had Subra also spoke about it, and Galen must have mentioned this at some point, right? But this is really something I cannot stress more, right? You need to be able to build a network. And what that means from someone from a non-tech background, it means asking myself, where am I good at? What do I have to bring to the table? Now, when I first started building a network, I had nobody that I knew UX, right? Because I had spent 6 years doing academic research. So I had a network in academic work and the academic global community. So I took those principles. I asked myself, how did I get to this point? How is it now that I have a network in the global academic community? So I asked myself, what were the principles behind of this? So I knew that I had something to offer. I need to think about like where can I begin? Where are some points of leverages? And one of the most key points of leverage was LinkedIn or social media. So I went there and I asked myself, can I communicate with people out there who are also doing UX? So I offered my own interpretations of what UX is. I offered and I engaged with other people on LinkedIn or on social media on what they were discussing with, right? Because I may not know all the content knowledge about UX, but I can ask questions to understand what they're trying to say. And there is a form of engagement. So that's how I started with building a network. Now the next thing, people do not buy. And if they do, they are not your people. So one of the best parts of being in the UX community, this is a global community, right? It's not just restricted to Singapore or region, right? You can connect with anybody who's doing UX anywhere. And people in UX are very open because it's basically their job. If they're not open to new ideas, to new ways of doing things, then they can't be very good UX practitioners. So forget about that. Find someone else who's actually able to understand there are many ways to get one thing done, right? So you need to understand that UX practitioners in the community are very open. So look for them and be assured that they will not bite. Now, all of that is fine and dandy, right? I mean, you've taken stock, you've reflected why you want to do UX, you've started to build a network, you've practiced UX. But really, the panacea to all of this is actually to get hired. Now, there are two things here for me. For me, one of it was the portfolio, and the other is hidden jobs. Now, what I mean by portfolio, so now I came from a non-tech background. I've done research, but the research that I have done is academic in nature, it has to do with schools, it has to do with education, it has to do with social sciences. So I did not have a clear product that actually would appeal to a UX hiring manager. But what I did have was the process. I knew how to think about a problem. I knew what kind of questions I needed to ask in order to actually come up with a solution. I knew how to ask those research questions. So I focused on the process behind the research as opposed to the product of research, because that is what I knew I had and I knew I could do that well. So I focused on that in my portfolio. Now the next thing is hidden jobs. Now nobody's hiding jobs from us. The jobs are out there. But what it means is that sometimes jobs may not always appear in a linear fashion. It does not mean you have to wait for the job to appear in the job ad. Sometimes jobs already are available. There are vacancies way before anything ever hits a job ad, a market, or anything ever hits LinkedIn. So connecting with people means that you have the potential to hear about job vacancies way before anything gets appeared on a formal space. So build a network and lean into your network when you're looking for a job. And always remember that when you engage more with people, you get the same kind of engagement back as well. So it's like sort of like a give and take. You engage with them and they will also engage with you. So lean into your network as far as possible. So now I'll come to the sort of roundup of all of this, right? So now one of the main things that I learned, because I did not start in the UX field as an entry-level person. I'm not a fresh graduate. I've had years of experience, right? So one of the things that I had to learn very quickly or very early on was actually to put aside like my own ego of who I think I was or who I thought I was, right? So I needed to be quite strategic in what I do, I don't feel like I need to be hung up over the job title. I want to do UX research, I want to learn about humans, I want to learn about user behavior. And that's really where I hung on to and hooked up to it. So I was a bit more strategic about where I'd like to, what kind of jobs I wanted to do, and what kind of industries that I really wanted to try. Now, transitioning to tech industry from a non-tech is actually really a confluence of many factors. It's not the one thing that you need to do. It's not the one thing that needs to happen for you to transition well. It's a confluence of all of these things. And these are the things that worked for me. And for others, it may be more or less of the same thing. Maybe so for some people, the reflection in the personal journey is more important. For some, the network is more important. So it's really about taking all of these factors into consideration and waiting to be at the right place at the right time, and to believe that it will happen. So now I just want to go very quickly into some misconceptions. So we've heard predominantly from UX designers, but there is a whole other field where UX research feeds into the design of the solutioning process. So I just wanted to give you guys a little teaser of some misconceptions about UX research. Now the first misconception, I think Mario touched a little bit on this, is that all stakeholders and businesses understand the value of research. Now, before I got into the field, before I started working formally in a UX research team, that was one misconception I had. I thought everyone, by nature, would understand the value of UX research. But that's not necessarily always true. What I did find out was that I needed to learn the act of persuasion. I needed to persuade stakeholders and businesses about the value of good research, not just any UX research, but good UX research. And I needed to be able to articulate the value of good research. So a lot of the things that I do is not actually the research work, but actually speaking to other people, helping them understand why we need to do UX research and why we need to do it well. So a lot of this actually also happens in my day-to-day. The next misconception that I've heard is that we can just do a survey, right? On paper, survey sounds super easy, right? 10 questions, you send it out to the world, wait for the responses, and you do some data analysis. But what I did find out is that surveys don't actually have very good ROI in terms of the usability of the findings and also the quality of data. And surveys are limited in the sense that you cannot dig deeper into why people behave the way they behave. It's at best good for understanding a large, broad-based demographic behavior, but it's not enough to understand why people behave the way they do. So this was another misconception that I also learned quickly. The third one is that UX research provides answers on how to design. Now, design and research come together, and usually, they happen in a dynamic fashion. There is no linear way. It's not research and then design and then it's a solution. Sometimes it happens the other way around as well. But the real misconception is that it does not provide you answers on UX design. So what I did learn is that research cannot tell you how to design. You cannot go to the users and ask them, what do you want me to do? Do you like this color? Do you like this placement? They will not be able to give you the answers. UX research is not about finding solutions. It is about getting clarity about the user needs and getting clarity about the user problem. And also to understand how users behave or the psychology behind their behavior, not to give you a direct answer on how you can design. Now, the last and final misconception is that data is absolute truth. Now, this sounds like it should be, right? I mean, I have the data. I have 9 out of 10 people want the color blue. Shouldn't that be absolute truth? Now, what you have found out is that you actually need to make nuanced inferences based on the context and understanding of the limitations of the research. And the other thing is always to repeat and iterate on the research to get closer to the truth. But you will never actually find the absolute truth because things are always changing. People's minds are always changing. The context is always changing. The types of questions we ask them also changes. So you need to repeat and iterate to get closer to the truth, but knowing that you will never actually find the truth. So data is not absolute truth. Truth is always changing. So I've come to the last bit of my presentation today. So I've started with a little bit about my journey transitioning from a non-tech background. And also, because I came from a non-tech background, there were some misconceptions around what UX research is and what UX research can do. Now, the main point here is that the journey actually begins here to find out whether you are able to understand why you want to do UX and whether or not how you're going to go about doing the networking and how you're going to go about actually building the right types of networks to succeed in your career. And all of this would be very personal and all of this would be very particular to everyone's journey. and no one journey is going to be the same. Yeah, I've come to the end already.
Thank you so much, Sham. So we'll have another Q&A session. You can take your seat. Anyone who would have some questions before I give time for people to write and type it? Anyone? Oh, there.
Yeah, I mean, I also work in the insights space, but not specifically UX insights. So I'm wondering, like when in your field, how do you translate human insights into design? Specifically, how do you work with designers, and how do you like translate specific insights into specific ways in which apps are designed or websites are designed?
Right. I think that's a great question. It's about translation of like user insights into good design. I think that actually has to work in a hand-to-hand process. Now, I work collaboratively with UX designers and product managers. So what I do present to them is actually the findings based on the research. For instance, the finding could be that users are actually to follow a particular flow, let's say a flow from A to B to C, and actually the designers find that actually flow B is not so amenable to the time taken, or that's not what they actually want to find out. So what I can present to them is that the users actually took this particular flow, and we want to find out if, let's say, the designers feel that this particular flow actually works for that particular product. So there's a lot of collaboration and there's a lot of back and forth between the research and the designers and the product managers. Like what Mario also alluded to, there is not just about user centricity, but there's also vision centricity that's required to be taken into consideration. So the business needs, the product needs, the designers needs, and the research will all have to come together in a sort of like a discussion before the design solutions are actually created. So I think there's no direct way to answer this question. What I can say for at best is actually it's a collaborative process, and it actually will take into consideration user needs, user behavior, as well as product and business needs.
Thank you. There are a few questions in here. Very insightful and inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
What were your push and pull factors when making the decision to transition to UX?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So I had spent like quite a number of years in academic research, and one of the things that I felt I was missing was actually looking at the research impact. I mean, as you might be familiar, education systems move slowly, and I really wanted to be able to see a tangible impact of the research that I was doing. So that was a really big factor for me, thinking about where else can I actually apply my research process skills. And UX research was a natural pull towards that, because I wanted to understand people, I wanted to understand why they did what they did, and I had a vested interest in this. So I think that was both a push and a pull, you know, the research impact as well as my own like personality and thinking about human behavior.
What's the most intimidating moment that you experienced during the transition into UX research?
Oh, thanks for asking that question. So, I mean, this journey was like 6 to 8 months, right? I mean, it wasn't like something that happened overnight, like, okay, I woke up one day and I want to do UX research. That did not happen. There was a lot of deliberate moves that I had to make, right? The first deliberate move was actually to understand the language of UX. Now, the very first interview that I did for a UX researcher role, I went up to the last interview, there's a round of 4 interviews, and at the last interview, the feedback that I got was that actually I wasn't speaking the language of UX, right? So that was like a huge, like a taking stock moment there for me, because I was saying thematic analysis, they were saying affinity mapping, right? I was saying interview protocol, they were saying interview guide. Essentially the same thing, but the language is very different. And the language is important because as part of my job, I need to communicate very clearly what I am doing in a multifunctional team, right? So that was a super important like point for me, and that was actually one of the things that actually was a factor in my taking stock process, right? And going back to intimidating, I think it's really about knowing that you don't know everything, and that sometimes you have to reframe your mind into thinking that you actually have to learn new ways of speaking about the same things. I think that was something that I experienced.
In line with learning how to communicate, right? There's a question here. How did you educate your stakeholders about the value of good UX research?
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing process, and I'm actually still in the process of learning about this. Right? I mean, there's always pushback from stakeholders whenever we share UX research, right? We tell them that users behave in this particular way, but yet they have a particular preconceived notion about how they should be behaving, right? And I think there's no straight answer for this. I would present the data and I would present that these are the findings. The stakeholders and us and the designers can actually enter into a discussion where we try to think about the trade-offs that we have to make, think about the limitations of those designs, and I think it has to happen in a collaborative fashion. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I can't just say, this is my finding, do this now, right? I think that never happens. I think learning about the collaboration was really important for me, and to understand that there are certain limitations and certain trade-offs.
Well, that's great if your company values the value of good UX research, but what if you are working for a small UX department? So any advice to someone who works in a small UX department that has no UX researchers, meaning UX designers need to wear many hats, including taking on UX research?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think that actually does happen a lot in many organizations. UX research as a field is like super new. People know UX design now, but UX research is also something people don't see like as a specialization, right? Because UX designers also do some form of research to actually justify their design solutions, but UX research as a separate entity and a separate resource is also something that's up and coming. My advice to this to actually look for small wins, right? What are some small research projects that you can do that actually has a direct measurable impact? For instance, if let's say you want to measure like click-through rates, right? Speak with the designers, like what can potentially improve that, and do a very small research, because once the stakeholders can see how this small research project can give you direct impact, I think that always helps. And I think look for small wins, don't look for like large big scale research, user behavior research projects that may or may not actually give you very tactical decisions that you can make. Yeah. And so be very tactical about what kind of research you pick, especially when communicating with stakeholders who don't always understand the value of UX research.
So have there been projects where the research generated wrong customer insights and then the design failed? If so, what went wrong?
So I would like to ask, like, what does that mean? Like, what does wrong customer insight mean, right? Because if let's say we are following a particular process behind like the research question, the objectives, and the questions for those research, it's not so much wrong customer insight. I think what I would go back to is the inference process or the interpretation of what we are doing in terms of the research findings. And remembering that UX is a lot of iteration, right? We're not going to get it right the first time. Nobody gets it right the first time. And it's always a process of iteration. If some of the insights resulted in poor impact or poor measurable metrics, then the question will be, let's iterate on the design and not about placing value that's wrong inside. There's actually no such thing as wrong inside. We are all trying to iterate and get closer to getting good design. We can never actually say that one way to go is the right way, one way is the totally wrong way.
Thank you. Okay, last two questions.
Okay.
How do you draw a line between your preference and what's best for users?
Well, I think as a researcher, my main disposition is actually to assume the position of the user, because I want to go in there to understand the users, not to actually impose my opinion. And I think that's a really important disposition for UX research, right? Because when I'm going in there, I don't want to tell them what I think. I really want to hear what they think. And I think that's where I will go in, right? I'll assume the position of the user and not as an actual user. I want to be in their position and understand them and empathize with their user